The morning of March 31st, 1943, dawned hot and humid over the Irrawaddy River Valley in Japanese-occupied Burma, where First Lieutenant Owen John Baggett of the 7th Bombardment Group sat in the co-pilot seat of his B-24 Liberator, nervously scanning the cloudless sky for the telltale glint of enemy fighters. At 24 years old, the Texas-born pilot had already survived 20 missions over some of the most dangerous territory in the China-Burma-India theater. But something about this particular raid against the Japanese-held railway bridge at Pyinmana felt different, heavier, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the violence to come. Baggett's bomber, part of a formation of 12 B-24s from the 9th and 436 Bomb Squadrons, had taken off from their base at Pandaveswa, India, hours earlier, lumbering into the sky with a payload of 3,000 pounds of high explosives intended to sever Japan's vital supply line between Rangoon and Mandalay. The mission had proceeded without incident until the formation approached the target area, where Japanese intelligence had apparently been waiting, having decrypted Allied communications or perhaps simply anticipated the strike on such a strategic asset. Suddenly, the radio crackled with warning shouts as a swarm of Mitsubishi A6M0s and Nakajima Ki-43 Oscars rose from concealed airfields below, climbing with alarming speed to intercept the heavy American bombers. What followed was chaos compressed into minutes. The snarl of engines, the rattle of machine guns, and the sickening thud of cannon shells tearing through aluminum skin as the Japanese fighters, piloted by veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force's 64th Sentai and 50th Sentai, pressed their attacks with suicidal determination. Baggett's B-24, nicknamed the Bad Penny, shuddered violently as 20mm cannon fire ripped through its fuselage, setting the No. 3 engine ablaze and wounding several crew members, including the pilot, Captain Lloyd Jensen, who took shrapnel in his leg and lost consciousness at the controls. With the bomber falling out of formation and trailing black smoke, Baggett seized the yoke, fighting to keep the crippled aircraft level as the Zeros circled for another pass, the pilots clearly savoring the kill. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Fuel lines ruptured, electrical systems failed, and the fire in the wing threatened to reach the bomb bay, where the still-armed payload waited like a sleeping dragon. Realizing that the Bad Penny was mortally wounded, Baggett made the desperate decision to bail out, ordering the crew to jump while he struggled to maintain stability, knowing that every second of level flight meant the difference between life and death for the men scrambling toward the hatches. One by one, the crew leaped into the void, their parachutes blooming like white flowers against the jungle canopy below, while Baggett remained at his post until the last possible moment, ensuring that everyone had cleared the dying bomber before he himself released the controls and dove for the re-escape hatch. The rush of wind was deafening as he tumbled into open air, the burning B-24 spiraling past him in its final death dive, and he pulled his ripcord with practiced efficiency, feeling the jarring snap as his parachute deployed and his descent slowed to a survivable speed. But survival, he quickly realized, would demand far more than simply reaching the ground alive. For even as he floated downward, he spotted a Japanese fighter breaking off from the main engagement, turning toward the descending American airman with unmistakable predatory intent. The Zero approached with deliberate slowness, its pilot clearly intending to strafe the helpless parachutists, a violation of the unwritten rules of aerial combat that nevertheless occurred with disturbing frequency in the Pacific theater, where the brutality of war had eroded any pretense of chivalry. Baggett watched in horror as the fighter opened fire on another descending crewman, tracer rounds stitching a line of death through the sky, and he understood with terrible clarity that he was witnessing not just an attack, but an execution. The Japanese pilot, perhaps seeking to conserve ammunition or simply savoring his advantage, then turned his attention to Baggett, throttling back to match the parachute's descent speed as he lined up for the kill shot. In that suspended moment between life and oblivion, Baggett made a calculation born of desperation and the primal instinct to survive. He would play dead, letting his body go limp in the harness, hoping against hope that the enemy pilot would be satisfied with an easy kill and move on, leaving him to reach the jungle floor where he might yet escape into the wilderness. He released his grip on the parachute risers, allowed his head to loll backward, and forced his muscles to relax even as his heart hammered against his ribs with such violence he feared the Japanese pilot might see it through his flight jacket. The ruse worked, or seemed to. The Zero pulled alongside at nearly stall speed, close enough that Baggett could see the pilot's face through the canopy, a young man perhaps no older than himself, wearing the rising sun headband of a true believer, leaning forward to verify his kill with the cold curiosity of a collector examining a specimen. They were perhaps 30 feet apart, close enough for Baggett to notice the oil stains on the fighter's cowling, the chipped paint on its Pyinmana insignia, the glint of the pilot's goggles as he peered at what he believed to be a corpse dangling beneath white silk. What happened next would become one of the most debated episodes of aerial combat in World War II, a story that would follow Owen Baggett for the remainder of his long life, told and retold with variations that made separating fact from legend increasingly difficult as decades passed. According to Baggett's own account, given to debriefing officers after his eventual rescue and maintained consistently until his death in 2006, he slowly, imperceptibly, drew his issued M19 11.45 caliber pistol from his shoulder holster, cocked the hammer with excruciating care to avoid detection, and waited for the perfect alignment. When the Zero's cockpit slid directly beside him, presenting a target that no marksman could resist, he raised the heavy automatic and fired 4 shots into the occupied cockpit, watching as the fighter suddenly nosed downward, banked sharply, and crashed into the jungle below in a column of black smoke. Whether this actually occurred as Baggett described, whether a pistol bullet could penetrate a Zero's canopy, strike a pilot, and cause sufficient damage to down the aircraft, has been the subject of intense skepticism among aviation historians, who note the extreme difficulty of such a shot, the questionable ballistics of the .45 ACP round against aircraft-grade plexiglass and aluminum, and the complete absence of Japanese records confirming the loss of a fighter to small arms fire on that date. Yet Baggett never wavered in his claim, and several factors lend credence. The close range, nearly point-blank by aerial standards, the slow speed of the Zero, which would have made it more vulnerable to control damage, and the documented presence of Japanese fighters lost to unknown causes during that engagement. Regardless of the absolute truth, what mattered in that moment was that Baggett was still alive, his parachute carrying him toward the emerald canopy of the Burmese jungle, where new dangers awaited in the form of Japanese ground troops, hostile terrain, and the countless perils of survival in one of the world's most unforgiving environments. The jungle received him with indifferent brutality, branches tearing at his flight suit and equipment as he crashed through the upper canopy, his parachute snagging on a massive teak tree and leaving him dangling 15 feet above the forest floor like a trapped marionette. Baggett cut himself free, dropping the remaining distance and landing hard on the root-laced earth, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending bolts of pain through his ankles and knees. For long moments he lay still, listening to the cacophony of the jungle, screeching monkeys, buzzing insects, the distant crackle of the burning B-24, and the more immediate sounds of human voices shouting in Japanese, hunting parties already organizing to sweep the drop zone for survivors. He had perhaps minutes, certainly no more than an hour, before the enemy closed in, and he forced himself to move despite the protests of his battered body, gathering his parachute and burying it beneath leaf litter, then striking out in what he hoped was a westerly direction, toward India and Allied lines hundreds of miles distant. The Burma jungle in 1943 was not merely an obstacle, but an active antagonist, its humidity soaking through every layer of clothing, its vegetation so dense that progress was measured in yards rather than miles, its wildlife ranging from the merely annoying leeches that dropped from overhanging branches to feast on exposed skin, mosquitoes carrying malaria and dengue, to the genuinely terrifying tigers, cobras, and the occasional rogue elephant. Baggett moved through this green hell for 3 days, navigating by the sun when it penetrated the canopy, drinking from stagnant pools when he could find them, eating nothing but the occasional unripe fruit that his desperate hunger compelled him to risk. On the 4th day, his luck expired. Weak from dehydration and malnutrition, he stumbled directly into a Japanese patrol that had been tracking his clumsy passage through the undergrowth. The soldiers, members of the 33rd Army's occupation forces, were neither cruel nor kind. They were simply efficient, binding his wrists with telephone wire and marching him toward the nearest railway station for transport to a prisoner of war camp. The journey that followed was a descent through the architecture of Japanese captivity, each stage revealing new dimensions of systematic brutality that would characterize the experience of Allied POWs in Asia. First came the cramped boxcar, its wooden floor slick with human waste, its heat so suffocating that men passed out and were left to die where they fell. Then the march through Rangoon, where civilians spat upon the prisoners and soldiers struck them with rifle butts for the crime of existing. Finally, the arrival at Rangoon Central Jail, a Victorian-era colonial prison repurposed for the detention of captured airmen, where Baggett was processed, interrogated by Kempeitai military police who beat him methodically when he refused to provide information about Allied bombing tactics, and thrown into a cell measuring 6 by 8 feet that he would share with 3 other prisoners. The camp regime was designed to break men through the accumulation of small cruelties. Rations calculated to induce slow starvation, labor details that served no purpose but exhaustion, random beatings that kept prisoners in constant fear, and the systematic denial of medical care that transformed minor wounds into death sentences. Baggett survived through a combination of physical resilience, mental discipline, and the fellowship of his fellow prisoners, men who shared their last cigarettes, their fragments of hope, their determination to witness the inevitable American victory that seemed to recede further with each passing month. In October 1943, he was transferred to the notorious Changi prison in Singapore, where conditions were somehow worse, the tropical diseases more prevalent, the guards more arbitrary in their violence. It was here in the crowded barracks where men died nightly from dysentery and beriberi that Baggett first told his story of the pistol and the zero, not as boast, but as testimony to the possibility of resistance, of striking back even in the moment of greatest vulnerability. The months at Changi blurred into a grinding continuum of suffering, each day distinguished from the last only by the number of empty spaces in the sleeping rows, the names of the dead read out each morning with bureaucratic indifference by Japanese guards who themselves seemed trapped in the machinery of cruelty. Baggett, like all prisoners, underwent a transformation not immediately visible to the eye. His body wasted to skeletal proportions, his skin yellowed by hepatitis, his teeth loosening from scurvy. Yet something essential remained unbroken, a core of defiance that expressed itself in small acts of sabotage. Work details performed with deliberate inefficiency, radio parts hidden rather than surrendered. The maintenance of military discipline among the prisoners that preserved their identity as soldiers rather than victims. The war's tide turned in 1944. Though this news reached Changi only in fragments, whispers passed between prisoners who managed to intercept Japanese newspapers or overhear guard conversations. The American island-hopping campaign advancing across the Pacific. The British return to Burma. The relentless submarine blockade that was slowly strangling Japan's empire. For the prisoners, this progress brought not hope, but heightened anxiety, as they recognized that their captors, facing defeat, might choose extermination over liberation, a fear that proved well-founded as reports filtered into massacres at other camps, of ships loaded with POWs sunk by Allied forces unaware of their human cargo. Baggett survived the final year of captivity through a combination of luck and calculation, volunteering for work details that offered access to extra rations, cultivating relationships with sympathetic Korean guards who were themselves oppressed by the Japanese hierarchy, and maintaining the physical fitness that allowed him to resist the diseases that claimed so many of his comrades. The end came suddenly, as these things often do. On August 15, 1945, the guards failed to appear for morning roll call, and the prisoners, emerging from their barracks with the tentative curiosity of men long accustomed to disappointment, found the camp gates standing open, the administrative buildings abandoned, the empire that had held them captive dissolved into silence and shame. Liberation arrived in the form of British paratroopers and American OSS teams, men who seemed impossibly well-fed and well-equipped, who distributed chocolate and cigarettes with the casual generosity of those who had not learned to hoard against an eternal tomorrow. Baggett weighed 98 pounds, down from his pilot's weight of 165, his hair streaked with premature gray, his digestive system so damaged that the rich food brought by his rescuers made him violently ill. Yet he walked out of Changi on his own feet, refusing the stretcher offered him, and in the medical facilities that followed. First in Singapore, then in Calcutta, finally in the United States, he began the slow process of physical reconstruction that would occupy the next 2 years. The psychological recovery proved more complex, for Baggett carried with him not only the memories of brutality, but the burden of his own story, the pistol and the Zero, which he had reported to debriefing officers in 1943 and which had since acquired a life of its own, circulating through military channels, aviation journals, and eventually the popular press with embellishments that made him increasingly uncomfortable. Some accounts credited him with downing 2 fighters. Others described the pistol shot as occurring during free fall rather than under canopy. Still others suggested he had used a captured Japanese weapon rather than a standard-issue Colt. Baggett corrected these errors when he could, but recognized that the story had escaped his control, becoming a kind of public property, a symbol of American ingenuity and defiance that served needs larger than historical accuracy. He returned to active duty in 1947 against medical advice, serving in various administrative capacities until his retirement as a colonel in 1973, never again flying combat missions, but maintaining his connection to the Air Force that had defined his adult life. The pistol itself disappeared into the chaos of liberation, lost or stolen or simply abandoned, leaving no physical evidence of the extraordinary claim, only the testimony of a man who maintained until his dying day that he had looked a Japanese pilot in the eye and killed him with a handgun thousands of feet above the Burmese jungle. The decades that followed brought Owen Baggett the rewards of a life rebuilt. Marriage to a woman who understood his silences, children who grew up only vaguely aware of their father's wartime celebrity, a civilian career in banking that leveraged the organizational skills he had developed as a bomber pilot and senior officer. Yet the story of the pistol and the Zero never fully released him, returning periodically like a tide that could neither be predicted nor prevented. In 1984, a detailed article in Air Force magazine brought the episode to renewed public attention, complete with technical analysis of the shot's feasibility and interviews with ballistics experts who pronounced it extremely improbable but not impossible, a verdict that satisfied no one completely. Baggett cooperated with historians when his health permitted, granting interviews that remained consistent with his original 1943 debriefing, though he increasingly deflected questions about the disputed details, recognizing that memory, even honest memory, is a reconstructive rather than reproductive process, shaped by retelling until the boundary between what was experienced and what was imagined becomes impossible to locate with certainty. The Japanese pilot, if he existed as Baggett described him, was never identified. No record from the 64th or 50th Sentai indicate a fighter lost to small arms fire on March 31, 1943, though several pilots failed to return from that engagement for reasons recorded simply as unknown. This absence of confirmation neither proves nor disproves Baggett's account. The chaos of aerial combat, the destruction of Japanese records in the firebombing of Tokyo, the passage of decades all conspire to leave the historical question permanently suspended. What can be established with certainty is that Baggett was shot down over Burma, that he parachuted into Japanese-held territory, that he was captured and survived nearly 3 years of brutal captivity, and that he emerged from this ordeal with his humanity intact, a record of endurance that requires no embellishment to command respect. He died in 2006, at the age of 85, in his home in Texas, surrounded by family and the memorabilia of a life fully lived. The Distinguished Flying Cross, the Purple Heart, the POW Medal, photographs of the B-24s he had flown, and the letters he had written to his mother from Changi, carefully preserved in their original envelopes. The pistol shot, whether historical fact or psychological necessity, had become by then something larger than a single moment of combat. It was a narrative of resistance that sustained not only Baggett through his imprisonment, but countless others who heard his story and found in it proof that the human spirit could strike back even when the body was bound and broken. In the end, perhaps, this is the historian's dilemma and the storyteller's opportunity: to honor the truth of experience while acknowledging the limitations of verification, to recognize that some events, compressed into seconds of extreme crisis, leave traces too faint for documentary proof, yet too vivid for dismissal as mere invention. Owen Baggett may or may not have shot down a Japanese fighter with his .45 pistol on that March morning in 1943, but he certainly aimed his life with the same deliberate courage, pulling the trigger on each new day with the determination to survive, to witness, to remember, and to tell. A trajectory that carried him from the burning skies of Burma through the darkness of Changi to the peaceful conclusion of a long American life. His story still flying, still contested, still alive in the space between what we can know and what we choose to believe.